We're in the information age, but facts are in short supply. Reject the noise, ask bold questions, and seek the truth with FBI whistleblower and common sense extremist Steve Friend. This is the American Radicals Podcast.
It is the American Radicals Podcast on a Monday. Hope you had a great weekend and get ready to get back at it on here, rumble.com/amradpod, and on YouTube, the American Radicals Podcast. You can also check us out at X American News, at Real Steve Friend, where we stream on the Twitter space, but it's more fun on Rumble and YouTube. So if you happen to be over there, join us in the chat on Rumble and YouTube. What are we talking about today here on a Monday, January 19th, 2026? We're going heavy into the Karens. It's going to be all about the Karens. The New York Times is actually coming out in defense of the Karens with a, as they term it, new term. Stephen Miller has a stalker. Virginia has now become a sanctuary state. Eating healthy for only $3, and a conversation about pushing your pet in a stroller. Like I said, all about the Karens. So much to get to. Let's get to it. Let's roll. I'm going to kick us off with the best soundbite that I have on the soundboard, just to get a flavor for what we're going to be anticipating, particularly in the first article, which defines a new term for Karen, and it's something similar to this one.
Classic awful, AWFL, affluent white female liberals. They're a scourge. That's the GOAT. It just is. But there's been a little bit of a tweak on that term, AWFL, affluent white female liberal. They threw in a U for urban to make the actual acronym spell the word awful, which the New York Times, at one point a newspaper, was recently decrying because the awfuls tend to go against the president of the United States and his party and his policy preferences because he's mean, orange, and literally Hitler. So they came out in defense of the awful Karens at the New York Times. The headline reads, "After Renee Good killing, derisive term for white women spreads on the far right." Affluent, white, female, urban, liberal. AWFUL. Majority of college-educated women, including white women, have long been skeptical of President Trump's Make America Great Again movement, and for months now, such women are attracting the ire of the president's supporters. So just the premise itself that the New York Times is setting up here is that these women were somehow gettable. They wanted to be welcomed into the big tent. They were, primed to become Republicans, MAGA enthusiasts. They really were willing to have their minds changed. They didn't turn out in record numbers in 2024 to vote against Donald Trump on behalf of Kamala Harris. Kamalamanism, one of the worst candidates for the presidency in modern history. Well, actually, the data says something a little bit different than the New York Times at one point newspaper would actually want you to believe. So I went out to NBC News just to make sure I was right. And it's a little bit difficult to see here if you happen to be watching on YouTube or on Rumble, but it's a nice breakdown of the different target demographics, the exit polling from 2024. What you folks should know at home is that Kamala Harris's margin of victory among college-educated white women in 2024 was 17 points. In fact, Donald Trump made inroads with Black voters, Hispanic voters, Asian voters, and he did worse amongst college-educated white women. I think Joe Biden got somewhere in the area of a 9-point differential. Even Hillary Clinton got 8 points. I think Joe Biden actually did better, but, there was a whole bunch of mail-in votings there, so you don't never know how accurate that was. And then there's another important, I think, data point that we should take in here, particularly in the context of the awful that the New York Times wants to write about. And that is a new poll that just came out. Headline: half of American women support abolishing ICE, polling shows. This comes from 19thnews.org. And this is a poll that was put out right after the Renee Good shooting. Now, why is that important? Well, I mean, the fairer sex is a little bit more emotional. I think even the Karens would agree on that. So, in the aftermath of a law enforcement officer engaging in a deadly force scenario where he may or may not have had a reasonable belief that there was a risk of serious bodily injury or of death to him or to someone else, and is therefore within policy, that might give Karens a little more the sense of the feels, and they might be more primed to be extreme in the response to that, as opposed to saying, hey, let's take a step back. Let's let the investigation bear itself out. Let's let the facts come on in. The snap reaction and the judgment from the AWFUL, the affluent white female urban liberal, is that we need to do away with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, one of the very few finite amount of responsibilities, the few charges that the American people expect of their government from that pesky, dusty old document that memorializes our social compact, where the American people agreed to give up some limited amounts of our liberties with the expectation that the government that we implement will do what it can to protect our life, liberty, and property, i.e., pursuit of happiness, through very specific duties and responsibilities. Chief amongst them is protecting the border and then kicking the illegal aliens out. It's not even a policy discussion, it's just part of the job description. But the affluent white female urban liberal feels a little bit differently. And now half of them want to come forward and argue that we shouldn't even enforce the border anymore. So back to the piece, though, which is defending it because they're saying this is a derisive term, even though aren't people who support Donald Trump, weren't they called maggots? But, he is mean orange and literally Hitler. So you probably had it coming from you if you happen to vote for the current president of the United States of America. Back to the New York Times headline: after Renee Good killing, derisive term for white women spreads on the far right. We dig a little bit further and we get a nice quote here from a former Republican congresswoman. Her name is Barbara Comstock, former Republican. She's just middle of the road now. She didn't completely do a U-turn radically to join the likes of the, how are they?
Classic awful, AWFL, affluent white female liberals. They're a scourge.
Barbara Comstock, quote, Trump and this administration are heavily misogynist, and that's always a big part of what he does. I think the problem is these guys all talk to themselves and they are in their own bubble. Well, I mean, Barbara Comstock, she's reaching across the aisle. She's not just having certain conversations with other women who are of her ilk, her education level, her socioeconomic status at brunch, talking about how they're so proud of their they-them child for cutting off their genitals while they sip mimosas instead of going to church on Sunday. She's never, ever been in an echo chamber, an ideological bubble. It's almost like they're incapable of any sort of self-reflection, which really is the criticism. I mean, it's a funny acronym. I mean, look, it's no different than Let's Go Brandon. Let's Go Brandon was not a way for the American people to say F Joe Biden. It was a way for us to be polite in the expression of F Joe Biden, but really it was a commentary on, we know you're lying to us because very clearly there were hundreds of people chanting F Joe Biden and you tried to somehow spin it. And the individual who spun it was, oh yeah, an affluent female liberal, most likely from an urban area, because she looked very uncomfortable doing an interview at a NASCAR event. Now, one more thing that I want to throw out here is that this was a hit portion of this, and mostly the New York Times is down for that. When anybody they have an opportunity to criticize for falling afoul of what they think is right think. They brought in Elon Musk for some reason, and they said Elon Musk shared something on social media. It wasn't even original to him, but I did think it was kind of funny. It was a quote that he put out on X that said, liberal women will divorce their husband and only let him see his children once a month, then cry about how ICE hurts families. Fair. Now, what's the big takeaway here? Been kind of hard on the Karens, hard on the awfuls here, but I think that's just a general reality. Touched on it. Women tend to be a little bit more emotional than men. When they see something that's a tragic event, their snap reaction is to no longer do border enforcement. I don't know. Doesn't seem like an objectively good decision to make. Now, in the personal context, I remember doing play-by-play announcing over a loudspeaker for Pop Warner football last year. That was one of the many hats that I wore as a hobbyist podcaster. And one of the weekends, our team was playing against a team from a nearby city. And unbeknownst to me, I was accidentally mispronouncing the name of the city. Wasn't on purpose. It was kind of close. The town is called New Smyrna, and I was pronouncing it New Smyrna, a distinction kind of without a difference. But I'm not native to the area. You could see how I could easily make that mistake. And then sometime around the second or third game, because I had to do 6 of these games a day, a female walked into the press box and dressed me down. Said, "Would it kill you to pronounce our town's name properly?" That's a Karen. That's an awful. Because she's never actually had to think about for a minute. There could be a physical consequence to being a jerk. She's gone about her entire life of just being the person that walks in and says, "I want to see your manager." It's like the famous Seinfeld scene where he's sitting there with his girlfriend watching a movie, and there's some early 20s, maybe late teenagers who are cutting up in the movie theater, making a lot of noise, being disruptive. And then afterwards, his girlfriend gives him a hard time and says, "Why didn't you set them straight?" And he goes, "Well, what do you want from me?" I turned around. I kind of gave him the half stare. I gave him the all the way stare. But if I go beyond that, I'm risking a punch in the mouth because he's a guy. He knows there's a physical consequence that could actually transpire if you engage with somebody like a jerk, or at least at that point, call them out on being a jerk. One more. I was a police officer. I remember getting a drunken and disorderly guy who had put his hand through a car window, cut himself up, had destroyed some property. He was going to jail. Now, while he's in the back of my cruiser, I'm taking him to jail. He starts coming out with some of the nastiest racial epithets that I've heard in a long time. He's a white guy. He's dropping N-bomb after N-bomb. And he says if any of those N-bomb jailers are going to give him a hard time, he's going to do something to them. Now, you're dealing with a disorderly person, particularly one who you're taking to jail. You have to call for some backup because you're going into a jail. You have to put your weapons aside, even your less lethal weapons and tools aside in order to escort the person into jail. Now, if they're cooperative, you do it one-on-one. It's a secure area. Even if they do wind up fighting you, they're not going anywhere. But if you're anticipating a physical confrontation like this guy was thrown out there, you take certain precautions. So I called up the jail and said, "Hey, I've got a disorderly, drunken guy. He's saying that he wants to hurt jailers. He specifically is dropping a lot of N-bombs and saying he's going to do it to African-American jailers. Would you mind sending the right people to help me out?" Hint, hint. So we met about a half dozen of the largest black male jailers that I've ever seen in my life waiting for us at the jail. And I walked him in and he put his head down and didn't utter a word. And then when it came time to take his handcuffs off and fit him for his jumpsuit, the jailer whispered in his ear, "You going to do something?" And he looked down and said, "No, man, you know I'm not going to do anything," because he existed, even in his drunken stupor, in a world unlike the Karens, that there's physical consequences for being a jerk. But the New York Times doesn't see it that way. In fact, they're defending Karen, the awful Karen, and saying that somehow she's wanting to open up her mind to accept the policy preferences of a mean orange and literally Hitler president. No, it's just always your fault for noticing that they're doing something wrong. And the New York Times is happy to comply with that narrative. Now, that's an overarching broad term. It's an overall 30,000-foot view of this particular cast of individuals. Now, do you have any actual documents? Do you have any receipts, any further evidence of this? Or is this just some sort of blanket term that you're throwing out to besmirch the reputation of a fairly sizable block of Americans, Steve? Can you do better? Do you have anything specific? Well, I do, actually. from the Washington Post, because democracy dies in darkness. And just like the New York Times, they came to the defense of this particular, what was she?
Classic awful. AWFL, affluent white female liberals. They're a scourge.
Headline from the Washington Post. She protested at Stephen Miller's home. Now police are investigating. Now, isn't this the face of evil? For those who are not watching us, maybe listening on iTunes or iHeart, this is a time. If you want to jump on over here, we're about the 15-minute mark of the American Radicals podcast. Jump on rumble.com/amradpod or YouTube, the American Radicals podcast. You get a nice visual of this gal. Her name's Barbara Wien. Now, they set up the atmospherics. Barbara's doing some gardening, and she's approached in her yard by some law enforcement officers and federal agents, asking if she is in fact Barbara Wien. There on her lawn, she learned that she was under criminal investigation for what she saw as taking a stand against the administration's policies. Now, you have a First Amendment right, but what did Barbara actually do? She was actually under investigation by Virginia state investigators because she may or may not have violated Virginia law that makes it a misdemeanor to publish a person's name or photograph along with identifying information with the intent to coerce, intimidate, or harass. It's a misdemeanor to dox someone in the state of Virginia. Now, 3 weeks earlier, what did Barbara do? I mean, she's, I guess, a former professor of peace studies. So she should want to be involved in anything that's violent or threatening of any kind. She's just a good American who's worried about her community. Well, apparently Barbara and her husband got in their car and drove around the community and put manila envelopes all over, doxing Stephen Miller and his wife, saying that we don't want Nazis in Northern Virginia, and putting out not just their photos, but where their actual address was. She claims she doesn't know, but she does know that Stephen Miller lives in the area, and she went to his house. She went to Stephen Miller's house and gave the security detail up front a hard time because they were sitting there with the vehicle and the engine was idling, like a security detail does, because you don't want to waste time putting the key in the ignition if you have to do a quick evacuation. And she gave the driver a hard time because he was spewing that vicious, vile carbon into the atmosphere. And then Stephen Miller's wife, Katie Miller, came out on the porch to find out what the ruckus was about. And that's when Barbara Wien did this little thing where she points to her own eyes and points them at Katie Miller, like, I've got my eye on you. And because Katie Miller is not a psycho and has an actual security detail in front of her, she perceived that to be a threat and called the authorities. But Barbara, she's not a Karen. She's not an awful. She was just doing what her own mother used to do. Another Karen, another awful, saying, I've got my eye on you. You better change your ways. I'm not really interested in you leaving the community. I just want to have a conversation with you. Is that reasonable? Is that logical? Or is that someone who's never had any fear for her entire life, her entire existence on this planet, of any sort of consequences for her actions? She's clearly a mentally deranged individual who went and threatened a principal of the president. Stephen Miller is the deputy chief of staff. He's pretty high up on the rung, enough to actually have a protective detail. And he and his family were concerned enough that they left and they went to live on a military base. But Barbara just wanted to have a conversation. She was willing to walk around the entire perimeter of the football field to pop into the press box and say, would it kill you to pronounce our town's name correctly? Can we have a conversation? No. Barbara is an insane person. She's an awful person. She's one of these.
Classic awful. AWFL, affluent white female liberals. They're a scourge.
Now, Barbara, she doesn't have institutional power, though. I mean, she's the typical person who's on your HOA, but they don't actually let you know if she's got any power other than just being an influence within the community. But she lives in Virginia, and Virginia just elected Abigail Spanberger as their governor, another AWFUL, Abigail Spanberger, who constantly claims that she was a federal agent and handled a firearm. Ergo, you shouldn't have a firearm because she knows better than you, because she's a Karen. She's an awful Karen. And elections have consequences. You happen to live in Virginia right now? Bad news. You're about to have a lot of illegal aliens roaming free. Here's the new governor of the state of Virginia.
And this executive order rescinds executive order number 47. State and local law enforcement should not be required to divert their limited resources to enforce federal civil immigration laws. It is a responsibility of federal law enforcement. Virginia state and local law enforcement officers must be able to focus on their core responsibilities, investigating crime and community policing.
So, what was it that Governor Spanberger actually did there? There was an agreement between the state of Virginia and federal law enforcement authorities that they would assist. They would essentially deputize their guys to a certain extent in order to aid in deportation efforts. Abigail Spanberger, she's elected, she takes over the executive branch, and she does away with it. So the adjoining piece that I have gives a little bit more detail. We'll just pull this up. Headline is Spanberger ends relationship between ICE and Virginia State Police. This was an agreement that was struck between Glenn Youngkin, who was not a really conservative stalwart, but happened to be a Republican, and he'll probably run for president down the establishment lane in 2028. I think I'll probably call that right now. But some statistics. I am a numbers guy after all. ICE detained 6,200 people since Glenn Youngkin entered into this agreement. The agreement deputizes Virginia State Police to assist ICE in its roundup of residents. Youngkin said that the target was violent illegals, but this news piece is really quick to say that 70% of those detained didn't have a criminal record. So what? They're all criminal illegal aliens, and 30%, 3 in 10 actually had convictions in this country and were still in this country. Sounds like it's pretty effective. But Saturday, shortly after being inaugurated, this was actually Spanberger's first executive action. She signed the order undoing that relationship. So now they're not only not going to cooperate, you can rest assured that the state of Virginia is going to work itself towards becoming a sanctuary state. If they don't actually declare it, I mean, they can just say that they're friendly and they like their neighbors who didn't come into our country legally, who don't subscribe to our social compact, who they committed a felony as their first act coming into the country. You can call it civil all you want, but it's a felonious activity. And if any of them happen to be working, they're stealing identities. Just because they haven't been convicted doesn't mean that they're not criminals. But that's what happens when you have the awfuls, the Karens, turn out in mass to elect somebody, which fortunately didn't happen nationwide in 2024. But now that the political winds have shifted and the awful Karens are out there in the streets, having never experienced any physical consequences for their bad ideas, you can bet they're going to turn out in off-year elections, midterm elections, and we're going to see this sort of political trend sweep the country. We can bang on them all we want for being, for being just kind of jerks about the way they comport themselves. This is a powerful voting bloc. This is a powerful group of people that controls purse strings within a lot of households. There's a lot of impact here. And the awful Karens, they're kind of feeling their oats. They might have taken the L in 2024, but they retooled, regrouped, and they're ready to rock now that it's 2026. Now, this is a kind of, it's more of an immigration thing than a Karen thing, but I do want to bring it up because it's a law enforcement thing, and we like to cover that here on the AmRad pod. So from the New York Times, at one point a newspaper, the headline, federal agent shoots man in Minneapolis, prompting tense protests. The protests are after the Renee Good shooting. That's really what they want to hone in on, because that awful Karen there who engaged in likely a violent action that led that police officer to come to the reasonable conclusion that there was an imminent threat of death or serious injury. And as a result, he used deadly force against her. Well, now we're just going to compound it more. And because it's the New York Times and They don't really care about facts, or at least they like to bury the facts. They'll lie by omission if they can't actually do it by commission. They report that federal agents just shoot a dude. What they don't tell you is that the dude was an illegal alien and he and two others were attacking the federal agent with a shovel. So the agent reasonably fired on those individuals and wind up shooting this bad guy in the leg. So the officers try to do a traffic stop. This guy ran away, winds up attacking the agents. There were two people that came to the bad guy's aid. They used a shovel and a broom handle to attack the agent, and the agent shoots his firearm. Now, let me kind of close a loop here on the awfuls, on the Karens, because there's a comment here that's listed in this New York Times piece. It's a quotation from Lish Kozlowski. She's a Democrat state representative in Minnesota, and she said that Minnesotans should be enraged by the report of another ICE-related shooting, adding that, quote, "We've been raising alarms that they are not here for public safety or for fraud or for the well-being of anybody, but to hunt and harm us." Who's us, Lish Kozlowski? Who's us? You mean the illegal alien that's in this country in violation of our laws? And ICE is just doing its job, the job that it's charged to do, that the American people not only voted for, we shouldn't have had to vote for it. That's one of the very few finite responsibilities that we expect of our government, regardless of who the president is, regardless of who our representatives are. Lish Kozlowski, though, is saying we don't want them here. They're actually making public safety worse because a violent dude attacked them. They should just take it, or they shouldn't be here to begin with. We should make Minnesota way more like the way Abigail Spanberger envisions Virginia. Just have hordes of illegal aliens running around. I'm sure it'll be safe to walk the streets if you're an affluent white female liberal who likes to go constitutional around the block every night in your Lululemon pants to make sure that the neighbors are mowing their grass correctly. Otherwise, you'll report them to the homeowners association. And you all should know that Lish Kozlowski, I found a photo of her. She, and I use she with quotations, is Liz is a female, but apparently Lish is a chick who feels like a dude. So mentally, emotionally stable person who's definitely should have been put into a position of authority. I'm sure that Lish got a majority of the female vote in the last election cycle. All right, we've got a couple more stories I want to get to, and we can kind of churn through them quickly. This one comes from the current administration, and it's a pretty bad fumble, lack of self-awareness, probably from talking amongst people within your own circles, in your own bubbles, and not realizing how much the American people are hurting economically right now. It's not your mama's show. It's your daddy's show. I call it fair, call it balls and strikes. This one's bad. And it comes from the Washington Post, because democracy dies in darkness. And it's about our Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins. Headline: a healthy meal for $3? Agriculture Secretary says it's easy. That's a woman who has not bought groceries in a long time. So Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins claimed that her agency ran over 1,000 simulations and found that it can cost around $3 a meal for a piece of chicken, a piece of broccoli, a corn tortilla, and one other thing. Okay, that's retarded. I don't really have to add much more to that, but I will, because the response I got back was from a man, but I don't know. I'd categorize him in the leftist camp, the camp that believes that calling Karen an awful is probably mean. And that's this guy, Joel Berg, and he is the chief executive officer of Hunger Free America. Joel says, quote, "Is it possible to cook one healthy meal for $3? Yes, it is. Is it easy to live a lifestyle where you consistently are able to put together healthy, balanced meals for $3? No, it is not." Okay, fair, objective. But then he starts talking about how every penny that you have to pay for healthcare or childcare or prescription drugs makes it harder to buy food. So his solution, because he feels bad for people that have to pay for healthcare or childcare or prescription drugs, is that the government should subsidize those. That's a very emotional perspective. It's a pretty feminine perspective, if you ask me. because the financially responsible, objective way to go about this would say, like, hey, these programs that have been implemented that are not written down in our pesky, dusty old documents, ergo, our government has no business being involved in things like childcare and healthcare and prescription drugs. I mean, you might consider them promoting the general welfare, but that's not what the founders envisioned as welfare. Welfare was life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, not free healthcare or Obama phones. But when you put these programs in there, and you might not be a totally evil person for wanting to do that, you just want to care for others, you, in essence, create a death spiral because you stand up a program, it's a bureaucracy. In order to succeed, it wants to get more and more and more people on that program. So it's a perverse incentive structure. And then on top of that, in order to fund that, you either have to tax people, so take money out of their pocket to then bleed some of it away in administrative costs and personnel costs, and then give some of it back to them. That seems pretty inefficient when they could have just used the money themselves. Or you borrow more money or print more money. And when you print more money, you put more money into the system, and it's more money chasing the same amount of goods, and leads to this thing called inflation. And that's when the dollars in your bank account become worth less and worth less and worth less until they become worthless, which necessitates more people getting on said program. It's not actually promoting a thriving society, promoting the welfare of the people by just handing out welfare, but it does hit you in the feels like you're serving people. It's something that would make the Lishas of the world very excited, the Barbaras of the world thinking, I'd like to have a sit-down conversation with Stephen Miller and explain to him how, even though he's a Nazi who shouldn't live in the community, it's fine as long as he changes everything in his policy preferences. That's completely reasonable. All right, let's go to one more, and it's a fun one. So as we close it out here on this conversation about the awfuls, we're going to have to talk about a social matter, and that is the pets in the strollers. So from the New York Magazine, headline, forget the cynics, here's why you should get your dog a stroller. You shouldn't have a dog because it's a wild animal, but I know I'm kind of extreme on that one. But if you do have a dog and you put it in a stroller, you're a crazy person. You're most likely an awful Karen. But I will give every benefit of the doubt, maximum grace. Why don't you make the case for us here, dear? That is that, quote, I admit it, I'm a dog stroller person. I'm also self-aware enough to know how silly it looks. Okay. I clock the side eyes when I'm pushing my Shih Tzu down the street. I'm very aware of the moms with baby strollers who look at me like, are you kidding? All right, so she's a self-aware person, but does she change her ways? Does she make a case? I'm aware of the sentiment in the least charitable corners of the internet that putting a dog in a stroller is a sign of mental disorder. I try to stay out of those corners. Well, you want to stay in your bubble, right? You don't want to have any conflicting ideas put out there that might have you change your perspective. Now we're starting to find out that the lack of self-awareness is probably a viral nature of the way that Karens and awfuls comport themselves. The assumptions that the stroller cynics make that you can bestow too much affection on pets, that it's overly indulgent, that coddling your pets is somehow bad for them, don't make sense to me. It's just functional and compassionate. No one is seriously replacing children with pets. And if they are, so what? There you go. This awful Karen says that it's just fine to replace children, people, with four-legged animals. Who cares? Because everybody that she talks to agrees with her that this is a great idea. This is absolutely sane and normal, and don't pay attention to anybody who's critical of you. You're a freak. You're a turbo freak. Nut job. I don't want you anywhere near my community doing that stuff. And the last thing that she says is that her husband died, and ergo criticizing her is somehow puts you into a sense of sin, into a state of sin. No, me saying that you pushing a dog in a stroller is weird is just me calling out what is weird, a statement of facts. But the fairer sex here, the individual who wrote it, what's her name? Amy Kellner, I think you fall very, very squarely in the middle of the worst people on earth, the awfuls.
Classic awful AWFL, affluent white female liberals. They're a scourge.
The ones who will cut off the genitals of their children so they can impress their friends at Sunday brunch, if they even have children. All right, so we've reached the end of the American Radicals podcast here on this Monday, but I'm not going to leave you without a nice palate cleanse. You know, the Karens, the awfuls, it can be kind of a downer, and said that they don't really feel like that full impact. They don't have any sort of fear of consequences, physical ramifications. Maybe we need to bring your T levels up. So I found a nice video here of a Soviet circus acrobat, and he's juggling 85-pound bowling balls. So let's give this a play. Enjoy, guys. He seems like he's pretty much in touch with both his feminine and masculine sides. That was pretty impressive. I really don't know anything else to say about it. All right, that'll do it for us today on the AmRad Pod. Back with you tomorrow, noontime on rumble.com/AmRadPod and on YouTube, the American Radicals Podcast. If you haven't already, guys, please give us a nice like, a share, a subscribe, do all those sorts of things. Leave us a comment here. Try to engage with you more and more. And until tomorrow, have a great day.
You've been listening to the American Radicals Podcast. Find us on YouTube, Rumble, and X at AmRadPod.